I get feedback from people sometimes who say, Maura, you want us to live in our feelings, right? Like, why do you talk so much about emotions and especially feeling anxiety? Like, aren't people going to use their anxiety as an excuse not to do things? Absolutely not. Your anxiety is not an excuse. Your feelings are not an excuse to choose not to show up, to choose not to act with courage, to choose not to push yourself or be good to other people. Your anxiety is data. It's a signal, and it's something that you need to learn to listen to and sort of co-pilot with. So today, I'm going to offer you a sort of cross post from an interview that I did on the next big idea. It's a great podcast hosted by Rufus Griscom, and we go deep into the anxious achiever and the scholarship and experience from my 17 years of researching leaders who manage anxiety, depression, neurodivergence, and other brain challenges. Rufus is an interviewer who really does his homework, and so I think that you, as listeners of the show, are really, really going to enjoy this episode.
Maura Aarons-Mele, welcome to The Next Big Idea.
Hello. It's good to be with you.
Maura, you've written 2 books, Hiding in the Bathroom and The Anxious Achiever, which is also the name of your podcast. You're a role model, in my mind, when it comes to demonstrating the power of candor and vulnerability in the workspace and the public sphere more broadly. You say in the first paragraph of The Anxious Achiever, I had agoraphobia when I was 3. I wouldn't leave the house. I clung to my mom. Hypervigilance, a state of extreme high alertness, began in my turbulent childhood and is something I still manage today. You tell us you had a panic attack when you were 19. You were later diagnosed with generalized anxiety and bipolar disorders and found yourself cycling between anxiety and depression in your early years as a young professional. Where do you think your anxiety came from? And do you see it as a kind of innate personality type or as a response to your environment as a kid?
I think it's really a both and. It's funny. This is the question that I have been asking people way smarter than me for years now.
Yeah.
Why? Why are we like this? I hate my brain. Make it stop. Why? And everyone's like, well, it could be because of your chemistry, could be because of your DNA, could be adapted. We really don't always know. But the key is to accept and learn to love it, which is hard.
Not just like it, but love it.
Love it.
You say that anxiety disorders are the most common mental illnesses. How common are they?
We don't have an exact number because we only know who gets formally diagnosed, and these things tend to be underdiagnosed. But in any given day, up to 1/3 of the American population is walking around with an anxiety disorder. And in truth, it's probably higher. The other statistic that I think is really remarkable is that in our lifespan, over 80% of us will experience anxiety or depression. It's just part of the human condition.
I found some of that data in your book, Extraordinary. You reference a study in New Zealand that found that 83% of people experience some form of mental illness by the age of 40. It's really kind of weird not to have a mental disorder of some kind. I mean, this is a very common experience.
Well, why would we expect to? You don't expect to go through your entire life without ever hurting your physical body, breaking a bone, having pain, getting a disease. So why would it be different for our mental state?
And so you say that you've learned to love it. You also refer to anxiety as your loyal partner. Do you really see anxiety this way? And how have you gone about learning to love it?
I really do. I really do. I get in fights with people who are like, how can you say that? It's terrible. And I'm like, yeah, it is terrible. But it's an integral part of me. And if I didn't love it, it would be like hating part of myself. And I don't want to do that. So I've learned to love it through a lot of therapy, like a lot. And trying to really understand my anxiety and be in a relationship with it versus hiding it, denying it, trying to drink it away, eat it away, shop it away, work it away, which is how most of us actually deal with uncomfortable emotions.
You make a strong case in your book that anxiety can be an advantage, a kind of almost tactical advantage in the workplace. And there's data that supports this, right? You cite a 2021 survey by SAP, Qualtrics, and Mindshare showing that C-suite and executive respondents to the survey were about 80% more likely than managers and individual contributors to report at least one mental health symptom. I think other studies have observed that CEOs experience depression at more than twice the rate of the general population. So there does seem to be a correlation, actually, between mental illness challenges, psychological challenges, and actually overperformance in the workspace. Why do you think this is?
And I will say that high achievers are more anxious. Why is it? I mean, again, it's a little bit of a chicken or the egg, right? Are we the people who are trying to prove something? Are we people who are running away from our demons and trying to achieve? Are we naturally touched with fire, as Kathleen Hall Jamieson famously wrote about the preponderance of entrepreneurs who have mental illness? Or is it really, really hard to be a leader? And of course, leaders suffer emotionally. I've interviewed Nancy Kane, who's a wonderful historian at Harvard Business School, and she studies leaders in crisis. And, you know, her take is that there is no great leader who hasn't been on what she will literally call the cliff of despair in the course of their leadership. And that makes sense too, right? And certainly anxious. How could you not be anxious? So I don't actually think it matters, but I do want to say that for my fellow travelers who have really tricky brains, it's actually your superpower. It makes you who you are. And when you can learn to have a better relationship with it, tools to manage it, you gain more agency, but you don't always just constantly wish it would go away all the time.
There's also evidence that it's not just anxiety and depression. I think there was a study from London's Cass Business School showing that as many as 35% of U.S. entrepreneurs suffer from dyslexia, whereas the NIH says 5 to 10% of Americans are dyslexic. So massive overrepresentation of dyslexics, like ADHD symptoms, I think also often cross-correlate with dyslexia, have been associated with higher levels of creative achievement in professional and everyday life contexts. There's a
scientist and psychiatrist, Michael Freeman at UCSF, who studies the intersection of certain kinds of mental illness and neurodivergence with entrepreneurs. And it is indeed true that entrepreneurs over-index on both neurodivergence and mental illness. And again, it's that knife's edge, right? Of I'm so creative. I think outside the box. I'm such a hustler. All these, frankly, wonderful qualities that come for us, but then also the fact that we have higher suicidality, we have higher underemployment, right? It's such a knife's edge.
You spend some time talking about the importance of understanding our history, our family of origin, and how that's impacted our experience of anxiety. I was fascinated by your description of Bowen's family systems theory, right? And how we learn, I think, often in our early family environments about how to respond to and navigate anxious environments. Can you tell us more about this?
Well, I'm sure most listeners will be familiar with the phrase, wherever you go, there you are, right?
Yeah.
And I love helping leaders and professionals understand family systems theory because they'll often come to me and say, help, I keep getting in these situations with a toxic boss, or my team doesn't do any work and I'm doing all the work. Why?
Right.
And then I'm always like, well, is this a a new thing? No, it happens to me all the time. And that's where understanding your family of origin and your family system really comes in, because our families are a closed system, right? And in a system, we all react to each other. We all function with each other to make things happen. And we all manage anxiety in a system. And that's really important. Murray Bowen thought that the system itself has anxiety, and we humans are always trying to manage it, right? So your listeners may have read that in family systems that grow up in tough circumstances, right? Say that there's a parent who's an alcoholic. There's a lot of anxiety and stress in that system. And so children learn to play a role to try to lessen that anxiety. One of them might be the hero, the kid who is going to just prove their parents proud to try to take some of that pain away. One might be funny. One might be the caregiver, right? We learn in our childhood, and we keep repeating these roles often in our adulthood, and work and our teams are also systems. And so if I'm really comfortable, and I am, coming in, taking charge, then I am going to attract people and create a system where other people are like, well, she's going to do it all. Why should I even bother? Right? I'm overfunctioning. They're underfunctioning. Maybe that's their role. And so when you understand this, it's just an amazing aha moment. And I really recommend, therapy for people to try to unpack it. So if they're repeating patterns they don't like, they can stop.
Yeah, this was kind of revelatory to me, that overfunctioning is often a response to anxiety or learned behaviors in an anxious family setting. And that would seem to potentially be a good thing. Maybe this is part of the correlation with success, right? It's that this overfunctioning. But on the other hand, Bowen points out that in the long run, overfunctioning is not doing you a service. What are the problems with having this overfunctioning response?
It's exhausting.
Right.
I mean, if you think about it in the lens of parenting, for example, we know that when our kids are little, we need to take care of them. We need to feed them. We need to clothe them. We need to do a lot for them. But as they get older, it's our job to help them do things for themselves, right? It's not appropriate if you have a 30-year-old kid and you're making them dinner every night, right? That's not good for them. You're overfunctioning. They're underfunctioning. It's the same thing at work.
Yeah.
Overfunctioning can get us really, really far, but it's not good for our mental health. It drives burnout, and it doesn't let other people shine. Leadership is about how good the people around you are. It's not about you saving the day all the time.
And so, Maura, what was your childhood environment? And so overfunctioning was one of your responses to it sounds like.
Yes, I'm a classic overfunctioner. I grew up in, a very 80s household with little parental supervision, child of divorce, just, nothing tragic, but kind of a tough environment where I grew up very early and took care of a lot. I'm really comfortable in that role. I'm really good at being competent, but inside I'm an anxious wreck. I'm always anticipating a threat because of my childhood. And so I have a lot of hypervigilance, which is we're all scanning the environment for threats. This is really common for people who grew up in tough situations, right? I never forget, I interviewed Jerry Colonna, who's a venture capitalist and a coach. And, he grew up in a household where his dad was an alcoholic and his mom had pretty severe mental illness. And he describes, waiting on the stairs every night to hear how dad was going to come home. What shape was he in? What shape was mom in? Wow. He credits that hypervigilance with his success as a tech VC. Mm-hmm. Because he's always looking. He's always thinking ahead. And that makes sense, right? But at the same time, it's kind of makes you a nightmare to be around, because if you're always on guard, right? And so that's the knife's edge, right? Is that a lot of these skills we develop as young people lead us to achieve great things, but they come at a cost.
You quote Jerry Colonna in your book as saying, "Warriors are not unafraid. The warrior acknowledges there is wisdom in the fear. Fear is the wish to keep you safe. strength comes when we choose to act in the face of fear. And it struck me reading that we could also perhaps substitute the word anxiety for fear. There's wisdom in anxiety. Anxiety is there to keep us safe and to keep the village safe to some degree.
Well, first of all, Rufus, I have to say you have done your homework to a level I've never experienced before. So, yeah. And that's the thing. So sometimes when I speak, I will get pushback from people who will say, you just want us to live in our feelings. You want to use anxiety as an excuse. I'm so sick of this. Everyone's in their feelings. And I will say, absolutely not. Your anxiety is not an excuse. It is data. Mm-hmm. It is a signal. But I am not telling anyone, and this is unfortunately what happens when we're in crisis with our anxiety, is we do avoid, we hide, we don't live the lives we're meant to live. I don't want people to do that. I want people to understand how to feel the fear and do it anyway.
It seems like the broad kind of reframing that you have done and that you've shared with your readers and listeners is this notion that the objective is not to cure anxiety and get rid of it, right? The objective is to sit with it. I think you've taken some inspiration from Wendy Suzuki here, to sit with your anxiety and embrace it as a kind of a flow state. If we can learn to be just stressed enough to maximize our attention and focus, we can turn it into an asset. Is that kind of the way you think about it?
There's a lot of scholarship around this. I am not a researcher. I'm not a doctor. That's not my job here. There's something called the Yerkes-Dodson curve, which is basically an arousal curve. And you'll hear this from coaches. You'll hear this from performance psychologists, right? Where you do want that optimal level of stress driving adrenaline, awakeness, right? Mm-hmm. To achieve peak performance. What you don't want is it to then kick into the freeze response, right? Or the flight response. Yeah, right. And so a lot of coaches spend a lot of time helping people live in that optimal state. There's also a big movement in trauma-informed therapy and trauma-informed leadership that looks at something they call the window of tolerance, which I actually like a lot better than the Yerkes-Dodson curve, because I think, we're all so different. We can all tolerate different levels of stimuli. And the window of tolerance is when you are well regulated. Mm-hmm. You kind of might be calm, you might be revved up, but it's still within the window of what you can tolerate. When you get out of that window is when anxiety can become paralyzing, right? When you lose the ability to act in ways that are healthy for you. And so I love to ask people to think about their window of tolerance, the kinds of environments, the kinds of stimuli that keep them feeling well regulated, not sleepy. And then when at work, especially, are they just kicked out of that window?
I don't know if you've encountered the work of the psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett, who wrote a wonderful book called How Emotions Are Made. And, she makes this very kind of persuasive case that our experience of emotions is very much through the filter of our cultural context. What we describe as feeling anxious, she would describe as a state of high arousal with a negative valence. So it's like a state of high arousal with a slightly negative kind of association. We're on alert. We're primed for action. Mm-hmm. When we think about anxiety, when I think about anxiety, I think about, Woody Allen, a certain kind of frenetic helplessness, right? There's a set of like cultural associations we may have with the word anxiety. But it really is physiologically, as I understand it, a state of this high arousal, maybe some discomfort, but that's a signal, as you would say. And if we can learn to take ownership of that and allow ourselves to reframe, recontextualize what that feeling of high arousal means for us, we can apply it much more effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing to remember is that anxiety is ancient. It's a lizard brain emotion. And what I've learned over all these years is that our brain can't distinguish between I'm about to get eaten versus I have a 4 p.m. sales meeting with Steve, who's a real jerk.
Right.
Our brain, it can't.
Yeah.
So our brain is like, help, we're about to get eaten.
Yeah. And Steve may be hungry, but he's probably not a cannibal. You're probably okay.
No, but he's a jerk. And he's going to shame us and make us feel bad or trigger us or bring back memories, right? We don't want to feel that way. And so our brain is doing the best job it can to make that feeling go away. And so even just knowing that anxiety, it's not your fault. You're not making it up. It's an important and crucial piece of your nervous system, I think is really soothing.
So how else, Maura, can we effectively manage our anxiety? What are some of the kind of tools we can use? I mean, what one comment you make in the book that I love is anxiety loves a goal.
Yes.
Right. And it sounds like there are techniques we can use to stop ruminating kind of helplessly and turn our anxious response into a kind of call to action.
So my big aha moment around this is when I learned that worry is one of our brain's favorite anxiety responses. So when we worry, our brain actually thinks that it's doing something useful, right? It's like, oh, if I just worry about this, right?
You're right.
And that's when we get stuck in the ruminating, right? Which we all know that feeling of just waking up at 3 a.m. with the what ifs and the, oh my God. And so one of the things that is just a very simple and very useful technique is to give your anxiety a job or a goal. And so imagine that you're in that swirl at 3 a.m. You're trying to, go to bed. You're lying there. Get up. I make lists. I make schedules. I make plans. I give that anxiety a job. There's a saying in therapy land, which is when you're anxious, just do something, both to switch gears, but also to take your brain out of the sort of repeat of worry and into action, because then the anxiety lessens, right? We all know that feeling when we're anticipating, right? When we have anticipatory anxiety, the hours before a big job interview, we're not doing anything, right? We're pacing, we're stewing. And then we walk into the room, we make a joke. Hopefully the anxiety goes away.
When you talk about rumination and I think of negative self-talk, which you write about, most of us experience this. You have a wonderful section on self-compassion, right? Which some of us will roll our eyes at self-compassion. I'm sure some of us think that the world suffers from too much self-compassion, but that's probably not the case, right? Does self-compassion really work? Do we really need this?
Capitalism is very anti-self-compassion.
Right. Yeah.
The whole pull yourself up by the bootstraps is not a very sort of self-compassionate message on the face of it, but there's a lot of science that's refuting it. One of the things about anxious achievers that I find endlessly fascinating is the extent to which they are cruel and mean to themselves to stay motivated. I have interviewed so many successful people whose constant inner dialogue is, you're lazy, you're a failure, you don't belong here. I have it myself.
Yeah.
And a lot of us train ourselves to motivate ourselves through that self-talk. And it can work, but only up to a point. There's only so long you can be cruel to yourself and push yourself. And so self-compassion is, again, if you're not into it, if it sounds too woo-woo, just think of it as a way to redirect the tape, to stop the endless, you're lazy, you're bad, you don't deserve this, you're a fraud, you're going to get fired, and just say, I'm just going to press pause on that for a little bit.
You quote psychologist Kristen Neff, who's done a lot of research on self-compassion, who says that while self-criticism can be a short-term motivator, it, quote, works in the way that corporal punishment works with children. It gets short-term compliance, but causes a lot of long-term harm. Well, that kind of resonated with me, right? Because I think a lot of us do have this sense that, well, when I really just self-flagellate and berate myself in my head, it does get me to kind of shift behavior or take some kind of action. But that may be a short-term solution that in the long run is not paying out.
Emma Seppala at Yale calls it your inner terrorist. If I may share something personal.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
I struggle so much with body image and the need to feel like I have to exercise a certain amount. And I am so hateful to myself in my brain about that. If I, eat too many sweets, or I miss a couple days of working out, or I feel like I can't fit into my clothes, I am so cruel to myself. And I have used that cruelty to make sure I was an athlete, make sure I work out. I've interviewed a lot of athletes, and that combination of really, really giving yourself all that hatred plus the sense of having a lot to prove can really motivate a lot of people for high performance. But then it just stops. It just stops. And I'm finding myself as I get older, I've been doing this for decades. I don't want to be this. I don't want to do this anymore.
Interesting. So it's diminishing returns, right?
Yes. And who wants to live in a place where you're I call it your own worst enemy. I want to be my friend. So we all struggle, and sometimes we're embarrassed to talk about it. But I think it's important to be honest, at least with yourself, and to say, I don't want to be cruel to myself anymore. That's not helping anyone.
Yeah, this resonated with me, that again, psychologist Kristen Neff said that her research found that people who are more self-compassionate take more responsibility for their mistakes, they're more conscientious, and more likely to apologize.
Yes.
So that really, because I sometimes feel that if anything more, I err on the side of being maybe a little too easy on myself.
Are you not an anxious achiever, Rufus?
I would characterize my own mental illness challenges more in the ADHD direction, which happens to be a brain type that I really enjoy. I like to refer to it as like the absent-minded professor brain, or I suffer from a novelty bias, right? Right. I love new ideas, love new thoughts. I didn't realize that I had what I would describe as a moderate case of ADHD until I learned that hyperfocus was one of the symptoms, which is not what most people would associate with ADHD, right? So it's a very useful kind of creative brain, but it can also make it more difficult to, get everything done in the right sequence at the time. So
I have a question for you. How, when you're in that hyperfocus, do you sustain the focus in order to complete a project once it's not new anymore?
I've developed lots of techniques, right? I think this is what we all do, right? Now in my mid 50s, I've had decades to to develop a range of different techniques to become more effective at sticking with like ongoing projects that are less novel and less exciting to me. Like an example of one thing I've learned to do, because procrastination is definitely one of the things that I've struggled with over the years, is I have hosting a weekly podcast like yourself. I've made it a practice to immediately following a conversation, begin reading the next book, like literally within an hour.
Wow.
So that because what happens is I get sucked into the next book and I've become very deeply interested in it, but I need to immediately initiate that process to sort of, so I don't end up in a last minute panic. But that's one of like dozens and dozens of little systems I've put into place, right, to try to offset the liabilities of this brain type.
Yes, I mean, this is what my next book is going to be about, right?
Interesting.
Yes, we all develop these techniques and tools, and a lot of times they work. But the thing that I think is remarkable about you, and that might be instructive for the audience to think about, and I don't know you very well, is you found the work-life fit that seems to work for what your brain needs. You've given all that anxiety a job by having a weekly podcast. You have deadlines. You've got to read the next book. It's not optional. And you're an entrepreneur. I mean, how long have you been an entrepreneur for?
Almost 30 years now.
That's a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is part of what we do, right? Is that we learn how we can best apply our brains with their strengths and weaknesses to the opportunities that exist in the world, and find the fits that are more effective. What other kinds of strategies have you put in place to quell the anxiety and be effective?
I take a lot of medication. I should be honest about that because I also have bipolar 2. And so, like a lot of neurodivergent people, I have a novelty-seeking brain too. I have a brain that's always looking for that next hit of dopamine. I also have a tremendous amount of anxiety. I am a catastrophist. So my big trigger is money, and I am always scared I'm going to go broke, which is an interesting choice for someone who's been also an entrepreneur for almost 20 years, right? People are like, wait a minute. If you feel like you're always going to go broke and you're always worrying about money, why would you choose a life that is feast or famine? Why would you choose that? And my only response is, it works for me because eldest daughter of a single mom with an anxiety disorder, I like to rely on myself.
Right.
I am comfortable doing that. And when I was in corporate America, the combination of my novelty-seeking brain, the way that I think, which is very circular, not linear, and all that anxiety got me in a lot of trouble. So I think, again, there's no right fit. And a lot of us find it through trial and error. But the most important thing is to identify what you're great at because of your brain and how you grew up and all the things, and where things are harder for you than they are for a lot of other people. We spend so much time trying to get better at what we're bad at, and we don't spend enough time leaning into our gifts.
One of my biggest takeaways from the past several decades of kind of trying to figure out how to work most optimally has been to really think about my success in the world as a group success, as part of a team of people, colleagues I work with and friends, rather than individual success. And appreciating neurodiversity as part of what makes those groups successful. And I think being very honest with everybody around me about what my strengths and weaknesses are, and also intentionally cultivating kind of team environments where we have complementary strengths.
Yes.
It's always struck me as logical that we probably evolved to have different brain types. And I was happy to see, actually, just in the last 24 hours, I did some digging to see if there was more consensus around this. And it turned out in 2021, there were some Cambridge archaeologists who proposed a new theory of the evolution of complementary cognition, which is precisely this. Our ancestors evolved to specialize in different but complementary ways of thinking. And I think we see this very clearly in the workplace, right? Because having built a few companies over the years, I've seen that you cannot build a successful company by hiring only people like yourself. It then becomes a new challenge to build a culture where we can accept each other's differences, communicate to each other what our strengths and weaknesses are, and try to make a really powerful collective team.
100%. I used to own a business. I sold my business. We lost 30% of our revenue overnight during the pandemic, and I freaked out. It hit all of my money story stuff. I had a wonderful partner. She's cool as a cucumber. She's a spreadsheet queen, and she made me a spreadsheet. And she was like, Maura, look, here's 4 different ways it's going to be okay. Having someone on my team who understood my anxiety, could tolerate it, and had a way to help me feel better was the biggest gift I could have gotten in that instance.
So how do you think about neurodiversity in the workplace? And is there, are there recommendations that you have for companies about how they can, and leaders about how they can more effectively kind of embrace neurodiversity in the workplace?
I'll never forget when I interviewed Christina Wallace, who's a professor at Harvard Business School, and she had a really traumatic childhood. And in every job she's ever had, she will say to her team, these are the things that trigger me. And when I get triggered, I get tremendously anxious. I get taken off task. And so if there's certain kinds of news to be delivered Could you deliver it in this way? And I think that that's, obviously that's a very honest example, but I love this trend of work style questionnaires, and it's really important in remote work. How do I like information to be delivered to me? How do I like unsettling news? How do I handle change? Do I like brainstorms, or do they make me want to hide? How do I feel about being on camera? Another one, and I talk about this a lot, is making sure you have clear expectations and you're setting clear expectations. If you're an anxious achiever and you hear from your boss, got to be perfect, you're being literal with that. You will work yourself to the bone, and you may not even know from your boss what perfect really means. If your boss actually said it needs to be 10 pages in length and it has to have this many figures and it should look like this, and that would be perfect for me, then you can deliver it with some boundaries. And so it's really just about clarity and people feeling free to get the best work done in the way that they need to.
When you're dealing with a moment in the middle of the workday where you feel just an anxious response overwhelming you, maybe even a sense of panic, do you have techniques that you'll employ to kind of reset yourself?
So my favorite technique is a grounding technique that uses a pen. And you can do this in a meeting. You can do this when you're giving a speech. And this is a really great technique, and it's part of in trauma-informed therapy, what they call resourcing. So your pen becomes a resource to you. I have trained myself to hold the pen and downregulate. I've trained myself to drop my shoulders, try to relax my belly and breathe, and try to summon a sense of calm. There's another technique, which is a little more controversial, but I'm going to share it with your guests because it's amazing.
Wow.
Where you can learn how to summon an oxytocin response in your body with a prop. Tom Bunn, who changed my life, he wrote a book called Panic Free, and he is a former airline pilot who does fear of flying classes. And he taught me and many other people how to think of someone I love. I think of my children when they were babies. You could think of your dog. You could think of your passionate lover, whatever you want, and summon that sense of well-being and oxytocin when we think of someone we love, and let that wash over you. That dispels panic and anxiety. And if you practice, you can learn to associate it with a prop.
Now, procrastination, as I've mentioned, is something that I suffer from. Is that now? I would imagine that it could be more that people with higher levels of anxiety and people with ADHD would make good teammates, because I'm guessing that you don't suffer from a tendency to procrastinate, or am I wrong?
Oh, you're wrong. I mean, we procrastinate for a lot of different reasons. A lot of anxious achievers procrastinate because they're perfectionists. And so there's just so much pressure on everything that it's impossible to get started because it's going to be wrong and it's going to feel horrible and everyone's going to hate me. So why should I start? A lot of us are perfectionists, and perfectionists often either procrastinate and avoid, or they dive in and overdo, And so I would say that we both procrastinate for different reasons. But again, at the very beginning, we talked about when you're anxious, just do something. And that really works. I'm trying to write a new book. Oh my God. Hard. Procrastinating. No one's going to buy it. No one's going to like it. It's not going to sell. They're going to think I'm a fraud. I don't have a PhD. All the feelings. And all I do now is I give myself 15 minutes to just try to put words on a page and not edit myself. That's all I can do right now. But it's actually helping me move through the anxiety.
You quote in The Anxious Achiever, psychologist Seth Gillihan is saying that there are two forms of self-talk that tend to drive procrastination. Number one, this is going to be a pain. And number two, I might not do a good job, fear of failure. And I consciously register this is going to be a pain, or I have these 27 other things I have to do first, right? But I do accept that unconsciously, I think the fear of failing underlies the tendency to procrastinate, because I do see a pattern, which is that I tend to procrastinate, particularly on high value tasks, and so that makes sense.
I mean, at the end of the day, a psychologist I really admire, Angela Neal Barnett, says that work is school for grownups. And I think all of us can relate to that feeling in middle school, where we walk into the cafeteria and maybe no one wants to sit with us, or we say something dumb in class, or we get a bad grade. We're human. We fear being judged. We fear being not liked. We fear being left out. We fear being shamed. We fear loss. It's totally normal. It's when we understand it and accept it that we don't get frozen by it.
This reminds me of a beautiful kind of moment in your book. You describe looking inward at the small, frightened child who still lives within. And I'm quoting you here. You write, 5-year-old Maura, defenseless and hypervigilant and desperate to please, peering up at adult Maura, who has so much more power, experience, and wisdom. And then you say, sometimes I picture the adult me bending down and scooping up child me as I would one of my own children, holding her until she calms. Wow, what a powerful visualization. Is this an exercise that you recommend for others?
I do, but prepare to have a hard time doing it at first. I think that it feels silly. It feels trite. It feels like, oh, I don't want to think about that, right? And so it's hard to break through. It took me, a coach first asked me to do this, and it was a hard time to get to a place where I could even be kind to myself.
Wow.
But it is a wonderful practice. It is true self-compassion. The other thing that you can do, and this is really easy, I do this meditation a lot with people, is if you're in a place where you're really mean to yourself, can you think of someone that you love and tell them, I love you. I think you're really great and you're good at what you do. Something like that, So easy to tell the people we love. Just that practice is so healing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When we think about this sort of negative self-talk that we all suffer from, you describe one of the voices in your head as being your mother's voice, right? And her insistence that, I'm quoting you here, you didn't try hard enough, that you deserved your failures because you bullshitted everything. And you said when that monologue starts looping in your brain, you stop and you say to yourself, hi, Mom. You just call it out. It's like
Yeah. Who is that voice in your head? Who is it? Is it really you? Who is it?
Even though I've said that I wouldn't describe myself as having high levels of anxiety, I do experience anxiety, as everybody does. And I think for me personally, throughout my life, one of the techniques that has been most effective has been befriending the worst case scenario. My mother was always saying to me, Rufus, how can you possibly, start this startup? You have no health insurance. You've got no, why would you do this? This is insane. And I've always sort of had a little bit of a distance between my extraordinary and brilliant mother and myself in the sense that she would always project a lot of anxiety onto the way that I was navigating the world. And I just would always say, Mom, I'm just at peace with the idea that if things don't work out, I will get a job at a coffee shop as a barista and I'll read a lot of books. and I'll be, like my base requirements for happiness are just not that high. And then obviously after befriending the worst case scenario, the next step is go work your ass off to create a better outcome. I mean, this is not fatalism by any means, but it's just saying, hey, we can, I can live with this worst case scenario. Now I'm going to go and create the great outcome that we want.
I think you missed a step, which is really important. Have people around you who are not unreliable narrators. So when we're anxious, we can be extremely unreliable narrators. And so in my brain, I'm going broke. I'm having to sell my house. My kids are living on the street. I'm not a reliable narrator. I need to have someone in my business who is, or I work with a financial advisor. I pay them because I know that for me to be left alone with all the anxiety about my money and my retirement for our family is not a healthy situation. So I pay to get help. And so I think it's that magic triangle of what Angela Neal Barnett calls the so what chorus. I'm going to get fired. So what? I'm going to not have a job. So what? I'm going to feel really ashamed and embarrassed. So what? And really you can play it out. And the other thing is to also, and can I give you one trick?
Sure, please.
So this is my favorite tool, and it's from ACT therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, and it's called the banana trick. And if you are either in that catastrophic thinking, your boss wants to meet tomorrow at 4, I'm getting fired for sure, right? You're feeling that negative self-talk, I'm a fraud, I'm terrible, do this. And this is Russ Harris, who's a doctor, and he is a big founder, actor in ACT therapy. When his anxiety was so bad that when he was in surgery, as he was cutting into someone, he would think, why am I here? Why did they hire me? I'm not a good surgeon. What if I'm going to hurt them? He would have these irrational anxiety thoughts. And so what he learned to do is replace those thoughts with, I'm a banana. I'm a banana.
Okay.
I'm a banana. You can sing it. Sometimes I'll sing to myself like, I'm a failure. I'm lazy. I don't belong. I know it's silly. It's separating the irrationality of the thought from life. And it can take a lot of the power away from the anxiety and the worry.
Maura, I'm interested to know how your own journey has continued. And obviously one of the things that you've chosen to do is to be extremely forthcoming, on your podcast and in your writing. And you write at the end of The Anxious Achiever, while writing this book, you had the worst mental health crisis you'd experienced in 13 years. Mm-hmm. You wrote, for weeks, I existed in a state of panic and anxiety. I couldn't see beyond my own suffering. And this was a few years ago now, a couple of years ago. How are you doing now? Do you feel like there's a clear line of progress, or is it bumpy? How are you doing?
Thanks for asking. I'm doing really well. My husband reminded me when I had that terrible depression and anxiety bout that it had been 13 years and I had come out of that, and I had 13 years that were mostly good, and I could do it again, which is hard because when you're in crisis, it's really hard to see beyond yourself, and it's hard to see beyond the next 5 minutes. And so my heart goes out to anyone who's suffering right now. I'm doing great, but I take my mental illness as seriously as anything else in my life. I have 3 children. I have a really busy life. I care for a lot of people. If I'm not well, it's not good for anyone. And so that's the other big shift, is that, I have to take meds. I have to see a psychiatrist. I do therapy. I do exercise. I do meditation, all the boring stuff, I call it. And I love athletes, and I love to think about great athletes. And the thing that great athletes do is they build in recovery. They build in healthy eating. They sleep. They get resources, right? If their thigh hurts, they go see a physical therapist. We are the same. If we want to be great, and show up for the people we love and do work that we love and make a difference, we have to be well. And when you have a brain like mine, it's the pain in the butt, but it's worth the investment.
I thought it might be nice to end on the topic of your most recent newsletter, which is finding joy. And you wrote, when I feel joy, I name it, and then I try to make a snapshot of my brain so I can summon the feeling when I need it. I see that joy pouring into my body. So how do you think about the role of joy in how we navigate our lives?
Joy is essential and hope is essential. There's science beyond it. We humans need something to live for. And joy can be cultivated. And I have learned this from meditation teachers. Joy actually is a skill that can be cultivated. You've probably learned by now that I'm very big on silly tricks and visualizations and ways to actually feel things in my body because they really work. And so what I would leave you with is when you're in a hard time, to have a store like Squirrel's store for the winter of joy can be really amazing. And so you can think about a time that you were feeling joy. It could be small. I was watching my daughter ride her hobby horse yesterday and just feeling like tremendous amount of joy and love. I'm going to store that. And build those feelings, feel them. Don't just say, this is a great memory. Feel that memory, smell it. What does it smell like? What does it sound like? What is the weather like? Build a sensory bank of it. And when things get hard, you can summon it.
I love it. How to bank joy.
Bank it.
Bank it. Fantastic. Well, Maura, thank you so much for being with us today and just more broadly for sharing your journey with all of us through your work. Such an interesting conversation.
Thanks, Rufus. That's it for this week's show. If you like the show, follow us and tell your friends. And please leave us a review. It really helps the anxious achiever get found by people just waiting for our content. I'm your host, Maura Aarons-Mele. Lots more to come in the next episode.